Hello and welcome to this week's workshop, Balancing TTT and STT, or how to reduce your teacher talk time. Now, in today's workshop, the agenda is to first look at STT, TTT and TTQ. After that, we will be looking at increasing STT and decreasing TTT, and finally we will do some practice tasks to apply the knowledge to our teaching. So part 1 is about STT, TTT and TTQ. We're going to begin with a task which is to complete these definitions of TTT, STT and TTQ. So what the three letters stand for, the initialization, and also the description or definition. For example, TEFL stands for Teaching English as a Foreign Language, and it describes the profession of English language teaching, often by international teachers abroad. Now please pause the video for a moment and complete these three sentences. So let's take a look at the answers. First, TTT stands for Teacher Talk Time. It describes the proportion of time a teacher speaks during a lesson. So in other words, how much time we are speaking in class. And STT stands for Student Talk Time, and it describes how much time students spend speaking during a lesson. In other words, how much time our learners talk during the class. And finally, TTQ stands for Teacher Talk Quality, and this describes the purposes for which a teacher uses his or her voice in a lesson. In other words, whether or not the teacher is just babbling or whether the teacher is using his or her voice to describe or say something important. Now, there's an interactive task next, task B. Discuss these questions with a partner, or if you're alone you could always write them down somewhere. Question 1. In an average lesson, what proportion of class time do you spend talking and why? Question 2. In an average lesson, what do you think the ideal balance of TTT and STT should be? For example, should it be 50-50, 30-70, 80-20, and why? And thirdly, what are the pros and cons of TTT and STT? And think of two advantages and disadvantages for each. For example, an advantage of TTT might be that the teacher needs his or her voice to explain something in class. So please pause the video and write down or discuss your answers. In answer to question 1, there are many possible answers. Different teachers probably talk for different proportions of the class time, and also it probably depends on the age of the learners and also the type of class and the aims of the lesson. For example, a speaking lesson, a reading lesson, a grammar, vocabulary, etc. Taking a look at question 2, in an average lesson, the ideal balance of TTT and STT should be, according to the British Council, the recommended STT, that is student talk time, is about approximately 70%. That's a round figure. According to busyteacher.com, this varies according to the level of the learner. The beginners need 50%, and intermediate 70%, and advanced students 90%, according to their website. According to TESOL scholars, from methodological textbooks, the general consensus is that it depends. It depends on the level, it depends on the learners, it depends on the age of the learners and the aims of the lessons. So bear this in mind as we continue with the workshop. Question 3. The pros of teacher talk time are that the teacher can provide the learners with a roughly tuned input. In other words, a kind of story or an anecdote or a joke which the students can understand, and they can learn from that experience as comprehensible input. Another advantage is that low-level students need input from the teacher, especially very young learners who go through the silent period And obviously there are other advantages such as instructions and explanations which the teacher needs to give. The disadvantages or cons of teacher talk time are that it limits student talk time. So, for example, in a class of 20 students, if the teacher talks for half the lesson time, the students each individually are unlikely to get very much speaking practice. Another disadvantage is that learners' lessons can become very teacher-centered, which disengages students and can bore them. It is the typical kind of chalk and talk teaching situation. Looking at student talk time, the advantages are that it allows teachers to monitor and to check errors and assess the students, work out what their errors are and work with their internal syllabus. And also, students need the practice because they need to learn from their mistakes and experiment with the language and try it out and use the new grammar and vocabulary, etc., which they've been taught. A disadvantage, however, of student talk time is that when pair and group work is set up, it can become quite chaotic, especially with young learners and large classes. And also, if pair work, group work is set up, or even teacher-classroom interaction, strong students may dominate and take over control or dominate the discourse. Now let's move on to part 2, increasing student talk time and decreasing teacher talk time. The reason we look at ways of increasing student talk time is because often, from my experience, an excess of teacher talk time is usually the case rather than an excess of student talk time. So here's the next task, task C. Make a list of ways teachers can increase student talk time and decrease teacher talk time. For example, a teacher can encourage everyone in the class to participate. Now please pause the video and make a list either alone or with your partner of ways we can do that. There are many ways we can increase student talk time, and let's just look at 10 examples. As we go through this list, try to complete the gaps in these teacher talk time reduction tips. For example, number 1, allow quiet thinking and preparation time before speaking activities. Often I observe teachers asking students to do a speaking task, a pair work task, a group work task, and after they've instructed it, they let the students go and they realise after 10 seconds that the class is completely quiet and they panic and then they start to re-explain the task and re-instruct the task because they're worried that the students haven't understood or they don't have the resources to speak, where actually what the class really needs is just 30 seconds to take some notes and write out a few words which they might use in their answers, or to just process the task and the questions which they're supposed to ask or the objective they have to reach. So that's number 1. Now try to fill out the others in this list. So number 2, give students time to answer. Count to 7 in your head. Now 7 is an arbitrary number, 7 seconds, 10 seconds, something like that. I think it's very tempting for us to jump in and answer or move on if a student is unable to answer very, very quickly to a question. So if you do answer a question and the student doesn't immediately come out with a reply, just count to 7 or 10 in your head. If they don't answer in 10 seconds or 7 seconds, then there obviously is a language problem and you could help them or move on in the lesson and ask a different student to answer. Number 3, let students answer questions and finish sentences. I have seen this, do it myself sometimes. When we ask a student a question, we sometimes answer it ourselves. For example, what did you do at the weekend? And the student says, I went to the sin, and then the teacher says, you went to the cinema, great, I bet that was fun. But the student hasn't actually said the sentence. It was a teacher who said the full sentence. So it's a question of patience in this case often. Looking at number 4, use gesture, eye contact on the board instead of your voice. That is to say, if you are eliciting something, or if you would like someone to speak, rather than saying, Michael, please answer this question, you can just gesture with your hand for that student to speak. Again, if you're giving examples of how to do something, you could instead ask the class to shout out the example answer to a question on the board as you write it. So without saying anything, the students in the class have said a sentence already, while you have just silently written the example on the board yourself. Number 5, get other students to say what you would say. For example, instructions. So rather than explaining the activity, you could ask a strong student or a weaker student to read the instruction in the book, to focus everybody in the class on that exercise, which practices their pronunciation, and also it saves your voice and gives them a little practice. And number 6, organise communicative pair work and group work activities. Obviously, as an alternative to teacher-student interaction, the teacher standing at the front of the class and asking one student or another student to respond, this IRF style interaction, pair work and group work really increase student talk time if that can be integrated into lessons. Number 7, avoid echoing students' contributions. So echoing is the repetition of the same contribution which a student has made, but this is really to be avoided mostly because the other students in the class need to be listening to that person's voice, and that person's contribution needs to be heard by others. Otherwise, your talk time is essentially going to be doubled. For example, if you ask someone, what is 2 plus 2? That person says 2 plus 2 is 4, and you say, yes, 2 plus 2 is 4. That's essentially redundant in the lesson because everybody has heard the students say it and they don't need to hear it again from the teacher. Number 8, ask or elicit rather than tell or explain. So, for example, in a grammar explanation, you might be explaining a tense or a grammatical structure. So obviously there is a certain amount of explanation which is needed. However, if the teacher keeps his or her explanation brief and then asks concept check questions after having explained the grammar. So, for example, if the teacher is explaining the present continuous tense and he or she says it's something to explain a process which is happening now, it may have started before and it may finish after, but it's not going to go on forever, it will finish soon enough in the future. The teacher can then, rather than explain in more detail, they can just ask the class a few simple concept check questions such as, is it permanent or is it temporary? As students say, it's temporary. And will it last forever? Yes or no? No. Is it happening now? Is it now? Yes or no? Yes. So these questions are eliciting for answers from the students and cutting down the overall explanation time. Number 9, explain, demonstrate and check instructions clearly. So this is a big one. I have observed teachers instructing activities quite clearly, but then once the class begins performing the activity, the teacher will notice that for 20%, let's say 4 out of 10 students haven't understood. So then the teacher tends to stop the class and then re-instruct the activity so that these 4 students, or this 20% of the class, understand clearly. And then finally I have noticed that the teacher will then resort to the learner's first language to instruct the activity. Now, I have nothing against using the first language. However, if we count up the number of instructions and the time the teacher is talking, the first instruction in English, the second instruction again in English, and the third instruction in the mother tongue, that's an awful lot of time for the teacher to be instructing. And so if the teacher is going to use English as a medium of instruction, it's very important to explain and demonstrate the activity. If it's difficult, obviously, if it's something that students are not used to. So, for example, if the students have to write a dialogue, the teacher can demonstrate the first few lines of the dialogue on the board so that everybody is very, very clear about what is expected of them during the activity. This can be followed up by instruction check questions if the activity is quite complicated. So, for example, the teacher can ask, Do you write a long dialogue or a short dialogue? A short dialogue. And do you work with your partner or do you work alone? You work with your partner, and so on, so that the students are crystal clear about what is expected of them, and there is no further need for instructing again. If, however, the teacher feels that this will be too difficult with the class, or if the students are unable to understand these kind of instructions in English, then I would suggest just instructing in the mother tongue in 1 or 2 sentences so that everyone understands fully, and the activity can go ahead with a short demonstration. And finally, number 10, avoid giving a running commentary of everything you do. So this is about describing what we're doing and, let's just say, thinking aloud. Now, obviously, from time to time, thinking aloud isn't such a big deal. Let's say if we drop our pen and we say, oops, I've dropped my pen, that's not going to have a huge impact on the overall teacher talking time. The idea here is to avoid a running commentary of everything we do. That is, when we drop our pen, when we realise the computer isn't playing the audio, when we realise our marker is run out and we have to go outside to get another one, and so on. So that's something to keep check on. And now let's move on to part 3, some practice tasks. Let's look at task E. This is, you will see here, a dialogue between a teacher and his or her class. It happens to be in Russia. And the task E is, think of some ways teacher X can increase student talk time. So please pause the video and make some notes or talk to somebody next to you about how this could be done. So you may have noticed that teacher X explains the activity not entirely clearly at the first instance, and then ends up explaining it again in the student's mother tongue. And you may also have noticed that the teacher's students tend to answer in one-word replies. For example, Artyom says the answer to number 1, B, which is quite minimal in terms of student talk time. And you may also have noticed that down towards the end of the dialogue that some problem comes up and the teacher tends to commentate on this problem at a time when he or she could get the student to speak a bit more. So let's have a look at an alternative way to do this. Perhaps the teacher is not confident that the students can understand this kind of activity. Perhaps it's more difficult, or perhaps the students have never done it before. So why not just instruct it in Russian first out, rather than say it 3 times, twice in English and then once in Russian at the end. So in this example here, we can see the teacher instructs it in Russian and does the example with the students. Now you'll notice here the students tend to answer in as few words as possible. However, the teacher encourages the learners to answer in full sentences with a subject and verb. And by drilling that, the teacher is increasing that student talk time just marginally, but again, overall, it's going to improve the amount of STT in that lesson. And as you can see, the teacher instructs and demonstrates the activity very thoroughly, which makes sure everybody's on task and there is no need for further teacher talk time, low quality teacher talk time in further instruction. Towards the end of the dialogue, you will see that the teacher uses this emergent situation where Dennis' pen has run out, and so rather than commentating on this situation with his or her own voice, the teacher encourages that student to produce a grammatically correct sentence which could be used in future lessons, this kind of classroom, useful classroom language which could be reproduced in future. So this is one example, or one way of how this classroom discourse could have more student talk time and less overall teacher talk time while maintaining teacher talk quality. And now we're going to move on to task F, which is geared towards professional development as teachers. And so it's all very well knowing how we can reduce TTT and increase STT, but how can we keep tabs on it? How can we monitor the amount of TTT we're producing and STT that is going on and the quality of our talk in class? So we're going to think of 5 ways we can keep tabs on this. For example, we could watch the CCTV of our classes just for 20 minutes or half an hour without sound, perhaps, to watch how much we are speaking in class. Many classes these days do have CCTV cameras in them, which is stored for 7 days after any lessons, so we could watch that if we were particularly concerned about how much we were speaking in one lesson. So please pause the video and think of 5 ways we can do this. So here are some example answers. We could make an audio recording of a lesson and play it back. Part of a lesson or the whole lesson, we could just take our smartphone and the dictaphone function and just record ourselves by putting it in our trouser pocket or breast pocket and listen to our recording after the lesson to see exactly how much we're teaching and what we're saying in the lesson, because it can often go unnoticed. Number 2, we could ask someone to observe us, a peer observation, and we could ask them specifically to note down the quality of our talk and how much and who is speaking in our lessons. Number 3, we can regularly observe and monitor ourselves, that is, just paying more attention to what we're doing in class and just listening to ourselves as we teach, and pay more attention and be aware of our TTT and how much our students are talking. And number 4, we've covered that before, watch the CCTV if that's available in your school and if you have access to that. Number 5, get feedback from your students. So for example, you might from time to time ask your students just to write down some suggestions for your class about how your teaching could be improved and what they would like to have more of in lessons and maybe what they would like to have less of in lessons. Or you could just ask them directly, if you have that kind of rapport with your students, just ask them if they think that you could speak less or if they would like to speak more, and so on. And we are now coming towards the end of our workshop with the final task, Task G. What one piece of advice about TTT, SCT and TTQ would summarise this workshop for you? What have you learned about this over the whole workshop? So try to think of one sentence, pause the video and write down or say that sentence to the person next to you. So as example summaries of this workshop, the message which I have tried to convey here are summarised in these 2 quotes by Scrivener and Harmer. Scrivener, 2011, writes, "Students learn a lot from their language from what they hear us say, but it would be unsatisfactory if our talk dominated the lesson to the exclusion of participation from as many learners as possible." So really, he's saying that obviously we need to talk to them and tell them our stories and interact with our students. However, we need to monitor that and make sure we do not dominate the lesson with our talk. And looking at Harmer's quote, "The best lessons are ones where STT is maximised, but where at appropriate moments during the lesson, the teacher is not afraid to summarise what is happening, tell a story or enter into discussion, etc. Good teachers use their common sense and experience to get the balance right." So again, it's a question of horses for courses and when our teacher talk is appropriate and the quality of our teacher talk. And these are the things we really need to think about all the time, all the while, maximising student talk time to make sure that the learners get ample opportunity to practice their language. And that brings us to the end of the workshop. Here are the references which I used to prepare the workshop. Please feel free to leave a comment below and like the channel. Thank you for watching.